Okay, welcome back, and we're going to continue with our study of the Arabian Peninsula, particularly prior to the rise of Islam. What we're going to do now is we're going to start looking in a much more detailed sense, and actually looking at the tribes, the nations, the people that were actually inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula prior to the rise of Islam. We're going to start off looking at the southern peninsula because, particularly in regards to Islam, this is the part of the peninsula from which Muhammad and the revelation or the depiction of Islam, what it came from. Again, going back to earlier sessions when we talked about some of the historical record, understand that when you look at a codified history, in other words, where you have codified laws, you have centralized governments with military and legal systems and religion and all the other things, those generally tend to be put together in a system with people who are living more of a sedentary type lifestyle, towns, cities, villages. And to be able to do that, you have to have a good source of water, particularly whenever you're talking about the majority of the peninsula, which generally tends to be Arab and very desert-like. So when we start to look at the southern peninsula, please understand that this whole concept of water is tremendously important. Because of that, and again, looking at the history that has come down to us through the years, that the history that we're basically going to be looking at in the southern peninsula is what would be the modern country of Yemen. So the majority of these kingdoms and tribes and nationalities and such that we're going to be looking at and talking about, just for a modern type of frame of reference, is to be thinking around the nation of the country of Yemen. The first kingdom that we're going to talk about is the kingdom of Ma'in. And this is 7th century BCE to the 1st century of the Christian era. Okay? This people, also known as the Manaeans, established a kingdom that was centered in northwestern Yemen. The majority of its cities were founded along the Wadi Madhab. Again, when you look at this phrase Wadi has to do with a water course. Many times the wadis only had water during particular times of the year. They may or may not have water throughout the whole course of the year. So this, the Manaeans, they established a kingdom along this Wadi Madhab. The capital city was Karna. It is now known as Sada. Was located along an area of desert that was known as Sahab by the medieval Arab geographers. This strip of desert is now known as the Ramlat al-Saba'atain. This kingdom also had another important city known in ancient times as Yathil, now known as Barakish. The Manaeans were one of 4 ancient Yemenite ethnic groups that were mentioned by the Greek scholar and geographer Eratosthenes. The other 3 separate ethnic groups that were identified by him include the Sabaeans, the Hadramites, and the Katabaneans. Each of these ethnic groups over time established regional kingdoms in the area of the modern Yemen, and we're going to talk about them later on as we do these sessions. The Manaeans were in the northwest. The Sabaeans were located to the the Manaeans are northwest, Sabaeans are southeast of the Manaeans, the Katabanians are to the southeast of the Sabaeans, and the Hadramites to the east of the Katabanians. As with most of the other southern tribes, the Manaean kingdom derived a major portion of its income or sustenance from the lucrative aromatic or spice trade. And they particularly traded in the spices of frankincense and myrrh. Again, if you go back to the biblical record, again, frankincense and myrrh were identified as gifts that were given by the wise men to Jesus' family upon his birth. So this was a very, very important aromatic, a very important spice. From a historical record, the Manaean inscriptions have been discovered as far away as Al-Ula in the northwestern Saudi Arabia, also been found on the island of Delos, as well as in Egypt. Mahin was the first of the identified Yemeni kingdoms to disappear, with the existence of its language apparently ending about 100 of the Christian era. The second kingdom we're going to look at is the kingdom of Saba, and that is 9th century BCE to about 275 of the Christian era. These are the ones that we talked about earlier that were known as the Sabaeans. This Yemeni kingdom had its capital city of Maghrib, located near Yemen's current capital, Sana'a. In Yemeni oral tradition, Noah's oldest son, Shem, founded the city of Maghrib. The kingdom's prosperity, again, was basically founded upon trade and agriculture, and that trade and agriculture, as you can see here, caused it to last for almost 1,100 years. What they cultivated and traded in spices and aromatics, again, including the frankincense and myrrh. These aromatics, as well as other food crops, were made possible due to their extensive use and development of advanced irrigation systems. And what they did was they put built large underwater water tunnels or underground water tunnels and earthworks, which brought the rain and water down from the mountains. And they also established dams, in rivers and streams to develop these pools of water that allow them to do these massive irrigation projects. The most impressive of these archaeological or engineering works was known as the Maghrib Dam. It was built about 700 of the BCE and provided irrigation for about 25,000 acres of land and stood for over 1,000 years. What's really interesting is the dam finally collapsed in about 570 CE, which was a couple hundred years after the end of the Saba kingdom. And when it collapsed, it had centuries of neglect, and probably neglect probably ended at the end of the Sabaean kingdom. But after centuries of neglect, the dam finally collapsed and was not rebuilt. When you look at the agricultural products that were cultivated from the soil, this 25,000 acres of land that was irrigated by this dam, these agricultural products were exported to the Mediterranean Sea, India, Abyssinia, and other lands overland, as well as sea routes. During the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Saba developed close cultural and trade relations with the kingdom of Demit in northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Evidences of these relationships have been located in the royal inscriptions written in a pre-Ethio-Semitic language found in the Demit artifacts. Now, a little bit later on, this relationship with Ethiopia is going to become more apparent, because Ethiopia is going to play a direct role in the history of the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. Sabah was known by the Romans as Arabia Felix because of its wealth and posterity. The Roman Emperor Augustus sent an expeditionary force under the control of Aelius Gallus, then prefect of Egypt, to conquer and subdue the Sabaeans in the 25 of the BCE. After 6 months of the expedition, because of disease and treachery, Gallus was forced to return to Egypt after an unsuccessful siege of Maghreb. During his return, he destroyed the port of Aden, eliminating the Sabaean interference to Roman geopolitical goals and guaranteeing Roman access by sea to the trade routes to India. Now, putting this into context, what you have is you have the Red Sea, and when you have the Roman influence trying to have military influence as well as cultural and economic trade routes to India and these other markets along the coast of Africa, even south of the Red Sea, the Sabaeans controlled a lot, particularly because of their port of Aden. They controlled a tremendous amount of the navigable waters, particularly through the Red Sea and then out into the Indian Ocean. So it was important to the Romans to take over this city, to be able to take over that influence, so that Roman fleets and Roman influence could be able to spread with very little influence, in this case particularly from the Sabaeans. The next kingdom we're going to look at is the kingdom of Hadramaut. This is the 8th century BCE to about the 3rd century, the Christian era. The first known inscriptions of the Hadramaut origin are for about the 8th century BCE. The kingdom or the civilization was first known to be referenced by outside civilizations in a Sabaean inscription of Karabil Watar from the early 7th century BCE, in which the king of Hadramaut, Yahidal, is mentioned as being one of his allies. When the Manaeans took control of the overland trade routes in the 4th century BCE, Hadramaut became one of its allied states, most likely because of their shared commercial interests. Hadramaut later became independent of Mahin and was subsequently invaded by the growing Yemeni kingdom of Himyar toward the end of the 1st century of the BCE. Hadramaut was eventually able to repel the invaders and regained its national integrity. During the second half of the 2nd century of the Christian era, Hadramaut was able to assimilate or take over or conquer the kingdom of Qataban, at that time reaching the zenith of its power and geographic range. Hadramaut was eventually conquered by the Himyarite king Shamar Yarisha, who was later unified all of the southern peninsula kingdoms. The next kingdom that we're going to look at is the kingdom of Ashan, or Asan. This is the 8th century BCE to the 6th century BCE. The capital of this Yemeni kingdom was the city of Hagar Yahir, located in the Wadi Marqa, which is south of the Wadi Bayhan. The siting of Hagar Yahir is consistent with the other capitals of the smaller kingdoms of the time, in that it was placed at the mouth of a wadi or a large watercourse or oasis. Again, talking about this, these wadis were of importance because of presence because of the presence of water during the rainy seasons of the spring and summer that was used for irrigation for agricultural purposes. This kingdom's existence depended upon these annual floods, irrigating or putting the water into the ground during these months. The floods, the way they did it was they allowed the floods to be able to, the water to cover the land, the fields, providing both water as well as a rich soil. So basically what's happening is, because it's a water course, almost like a stream or a river, soil is picked up, is brought along with the water, and then with the irrigation, the water as well as the soil is allowed to be deposited over these irrigable these lands, and from that they raise their crops. The kingdom of Mahin was located in the Wadi Jaf, Marib in the Wadi Dana, Timnah in the Wadi Bahin, and Hagar Yahir in the Wadi Marka, and Shabwa in the Wadi Irma. I just mentioned this to be able to say, again, we're talking about these particular capital cities, and each one of these capital cities, as we mentioned earlier, are established or built in these wadis, or at the confluence, or along their progression of these wadis, these water courses. The only remaining evidence of this particular people, the Ahsan, is a tell. And a tell is an artificial man-made mound, and this tell is known as Hagar Asphalt. Archaeological evidence places the destruction of the capital city in the 7th century BCE by the king Mukarib of Sabah by the name of Karib il-Watar. This destruction is described in a Sabaean text that explains the importance of conquering this kingdom to meet Sabaean strategic plans. Artifacts, particularly ceramics, discovered by Muhammad Said Ayub in the mid-1990s, seems to indicate a rebuilding of the capital city toward the end of the 2nd century of the BCE. The archaeological evidence seems to support the city's existence from the 2nd century BCE to the beginning of the 1st century of the Christian era. According to this evidence, the city for its time was extremely and unusually large, comprising about 160,000 square meters enclosed within the city's walls. Based on what they've been able to find from the archaeological evidence, it seems to have been influenced by Greek culture. It had temples and a palace structure surrounded by mud brick dwellings, with a probable site for a souk or a market, as well as an enclosed area that most likely served the needs of the camel caravans. Again, what you're looking at here is the importance of these trade routes, the importance of trade, and of being able to move these trade products from one place to another through these cities, whether they actually originated within the kingdom of Ahsan or somewhere else. Excavations have discovered building foundations made of kiln-fired bricks. The artifacts discovered on the city site also correspond closely with inscriptions describing a king of Ahsan who was deified at exactly this time. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. The deification of individual human beings was a very rare practice in the time. It wasn't necessarily the same type of practice that was later taken on by the Romans, who deified their emperors. This was a very rare occurrence. So when this man was deified, it was a very, very important and rare occasion. As a matter of fact, the archaeologists have determined that this particular king was the only Yemeni king to have been described of divinity by his people. His surviving portrait statuette is dressed in a Greek fashion, contrasting with those of his predecessors who were dressed in an Arabian style with a kilt and with a shawl. The abandoning of the city in the first half of the 1st century of the Christian era is probably linked to the ceasing of the natural water flow required for the agricultural efforts, and is also evidenced by the radiocarbon dating of soil sediments still found in the wadis. The city was never built after, or never rebuilt after the water flow stopped. Again, this points to the importance of water to be able to raise these crops, to be able to sustain the people and their livestock. So for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, we're gonna stop for right now. If you're interested in listening to more of this particular session, please go to the website halcyoniapublishing.com, where you can be able to purchase the rest of the session. If you're interested in reading more about these particular terms and phrases, you can be able to, on the Halcyon Pub website, you can be able to purchase Islam, The Way of Submission, which is kind of a dictionary explaining these terms and phrases, or you can purchase this book on Kindle in a Kindle format. So until the next time, good luck and have a great day. All right, for those